Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm super excited to be getting stuck into the world of EQ and equalizers with you. Let's do it. So in this video and over the next few videos, I'm going to be doing a real deep dive with you, telling you all the things, all the fundamental things that you need to know about equalizers, EQ, what you need to look out for, how to use them, how to get it done. So I hope this is going to be really, really valuable and useful for you. With that said, let's get straight into it. So here I am in my DAW. This is Logic. I've got just a little vocal loop that I'm going to use just to demonstrate the first point with you here. It's just taken from the Apple Loops library. Now, the very first thing that you need to be aware of when we're thinking about EQing something is what you're actually trying to achieve when you EQ something. Equalizing something, or EQing something for short, is a very simple concept. It's the principle of turning a part of that sound up or down, making a part of that sound louder or quieter. But in order to understand what we mean by a part of that sound, we have to define what that sound could be comprised of. In order to do that, we need to think about what we as humans can hear, because what we can perceive as sound as humans is different to what dogs can hear, or whales can hear, or bats. Different species can hear different bits of sound. So the human ear can hear frequencies between 20 hertz in the low end and 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz in the high end. That is the human hearing spectrum. We can hear more or less those frequencies. Now, as people get older, people tend to lose some of their hearing in the higher end. So people will tend to lose frequencies coming from the 20k end coming downwards, which is an interesting thing to know. It's neither here nor there really in terms of the concepts that we're going to learn, but it's an interesting point. So if we very quickly look at any equalizer, let's just take Logic Pro's stock parametric EQ here. This horizontal line that we've got shows us the audible frequency spectrum for a human. And you'll see that down the bottom, we've got 20, which is 20 hertz. And up the top, we've got 20K, which is 20 kilohertz. So you'll see that in Logic stock EQ and in most equalizers, they know that the human frequency range is defined. It's a certain amount, and they don't give you access to anything else because it's pointless. That's a useful thing to know first and foremost. The other thing that we need to define in terms of the frequency spectrum is what is a hertz, right? When we're talking about 20 hertz or 20 kilohertz, what does that actually mean? Well, 1 hertz is 1 cycle, 1 full oscillation of the waveform. So if you have 20 hertz, it means you're going up and down 20 times a second, okay? That's relatively slow in terms of how the human ear can respond to those vibrations. If you think about a sound coming from a source, so let's say, for the sake of argument, a bass guitar, right? A low instrument. If you think about the sound that's coming from the bass guitar entering your eardrum is going to respond to those frequency vibrations in the air, and 20 hertz will mean that your eardrum is being moved backwards and forwards 20 times a second, okay? 20 hertz. Conversely, a really high-pitched sound, let's take just as an example a flute. Let's say that the frequency being emitted from the flute is at 20 kilohertz. That sound is going to come out of the flute, go into your ear, and your eardrum is going to be moved forwards and backwards 20,000 times a second. So the frequency, i.e. the rate of the vibration, is a lot faster. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about hertz, or some people talk about cycles. We're literally talking about the way in which the waveform moves above and below the zero crossing line. That is the line across the center of our equalizer, the zero crossing line. How many times do we do that a second? 20 hertz in the low end is very slow, which means that we have long wave formats because the waves are much slower, whereas 20 kilohertz will mean that we've got much shorter waveforms, because we've got to do 20,000 oscillations in the same period of time as we do 20 in the low end. Okay, so we've defined what we mean by the frequency spectrum, and we understand now what a cycle or what a hertz is. Now we need to figure out what it is that we are listening out for, or what it is that we're looking for when we're looking at an equalizer. So in order to do that, let's just play this little vocal sample, and you'll see on this equalizer a representation of this little performance appearing on this parametric display.
You and me forever walking.
Okay, let's see that again.
You and me forever walking.
Okay, let's look one more time.
You and me forever walking.
So you'll see we've got information here, which is the sort of the highest area, and then further information that kind of gets quieter and quieter going down here, and some other stuff down here. Now, in order to capture that information, I'm actually going to pull up a different EQ that will allow me to kind of freeze that information in time. Let's make this as big as it will go as well.
You and me forever walking.
Let's play it a couple of times.
You and me forever walking.
Okay, so this is a representation of all of the frequencies that are present in that little vocal sample. So you can see that in this area here, we've got the most frequency content present. This is the highest peak, if you like. There's the most amount of content in that area. Then there's further content as we get higher and higher in the frequency spectrum, but it's getting sort of gradually less and less until in the extreme high end, we've got very little. Below that highest peak, you'll see that we've got some other information that is there. It's present, but it's nothing like as loud, as prominent as the other stuff in that little vocal snippet. So what are we listening to? In order to understand what we're listening to, we need to understand the concept of fundamentals and overtones. All sounds are comprised of those two elements, fundamentals and overtones. That's it. There's nothing else in a sound other than fundamentals and overtones. The fundamental of a note or a sound is the lowest prominent pitch. So in this instance, with this little vocal sample, our fundamental is around here, this D-sharp 5. Oh, I've lost it.
You and me forever walking.
Okay, there's a fresh capture. So around here, this D-sharp 5, that is the fundamental of that little performance. That is the main note. Now, every other frequency that comes subsequently above the fundamental is generated, if you like, or is specified by what the fundamental is, and is created by something called the harmonic overtone series. So what it basically means is that based upon the fundamental of that note, all of the subsequent frequencies that are going to come above it are a result of the fundamental. Now, I'm not going to go into the full science and theory of what the harmonic overtone series is and how those overtones are created. It's a deep subject. We don't actually, for our purposes right now, need to understand it fully. But basically, the first harmonic is going to be an octave above the fundamental. The second harmonic is going to be a fifth above the first harmonic. The third harmonic will be a fourth above the second. The fourth harmonic will be a third above the fourth, and so on and so on. So as the harmonic overtone series goes up, the harmonics will get closer and closer together. So any harmonic that is created as a result of our fundamental here, as we get higher up the frequency spectrum, those subsequent harmonics will get closer and closer together. Why is that a useful thing for us to know and to understand? Well, because as harmonics get stacked upon each other, some will sound pleasant and some will sound less pleasant, because some will work harmonically within the song that you're creating and some will work less well within the song that we're creating. So it allows us to understand that there are likely to be parts of the sound that we are working with that probably will work less pleasantly with the rest of our mix than other parts of that sound. Now, don't get me wrong here. What I'm not trying to say at this point is, oh, there's going to be nasty harmonics within every sound and we need to go and find them and remove them. That's not what I'm saying. Sometimes there will be harmonics that are more prominent and become less pleasant. And sometimes we'll want to find things and reduce them. But it's by no means always that way. Plenty of times you'll come across sounds where the harmonic overtone series of that sound works just fine and you don't have problems to go and solve. But we need to be aware that there can be harmonics that sometimes will clash with other things, other elements in our mix. That's all I'm saying. Okay, now it's also important to say, especially with a part like this, a vocal part where the pitch is not a fixed pitch, our singer here is not just singing one note, the fundamental, of course, is going to change dependent upon the note that is being sung. He's not just singing one note, he's singing a range of notes. So this equalizer here has captured what it considers to be the strongest fundamental in that little clip. But if he all of a sudden started singing a really low passage, that fundamental would move down, and vice versa. If he started singing a really high passage, that fundamental would move up. So unless your equalizer is on a sound source where the pitch is the same every single time, for example, a percussion instrument, that's a good example, the fundamental is not necessarily going to be one single note. So you need to be able to assess what is, the most prominent fundamental or what is the lowest fundamental within what the source that you're working with. That's an important clarification to make, okay? Now, let's move on to being able to define or identify different parts of the frequency spectrum. Because if we go back to our EQ here, we've got a wide range of frequencies available to us. We want to be able to specify exactly what we're talking about. So, the easiest way to talk about frequencies is in terms of low frequencies, mid frequencies, and high frequencies. I'm sure you've seen on many devices, maybe in your car or on a stereo, or maybe even on an iPod or an MP3 player if you had one of those previously. Lots and lots of devices have equalizers built in, and the simplest way to have that is just lows, mids, and highs. If you're a guitarist, you'll have had that on every amplifier that you've ever used. Low frequencies, generally speaking, are defined as from 20 Hertz up to 300 Hertz. Okay, that's generally speaking what people consider to be low frequencies. Mid frequencies, therefore, takes us from 300 Hertz up to 5 kilohertz, more or less. And therefore the high frequencies, the high end is from 5 kilohertz up to 20 kilohertz. Those are the three kind of frequency areas. 20 hertz to 300, 300 to 5K, and 5K to 20K. But that's not that specific. That's not that helpful. It's a good start, but we need to be able to articulate our frequency needs and desires more specifically than that. We need to be able to break these things down into more defined bands. So what I've got for you, and what you can download using the link in the description for free, is a frequency chart. Now, you will see that in our low category, we can split it into 4 different bands. So sub-bass takes us from 20 to 40 hertz, low bass from 40 to 80 hertz, mid bass from 80 to 160 hertz, and upper bass from 160 to 300 hertz. Now, each one of those sections, each band, if you like, have frequency characteristics that are associated with them. So sometimes if you're working with a client or if you're working on a mix, someone might articulate an opinion about a sound, not in terms of a frequency band, but in terms of a characteristic. So they might say, oh, that sound feels really rumbly, or that sound feels really muddy. How do you interpret those non-musical characteristics and find that frequency that's relevant to that characteristic and adjust it? Well, what I've done for you here is to put all those characteristics on this chart. So if someone says to you, oh, there's lots of rumble in that, can we remove the rumble? You go, ah, yeah, rumble, okay. 20 to 40 hertz, I've got too much of that, so that's the area that I'm looking at. Oh, that's really boomy. Okay, I'm in the 40 to 80 hertz range. Let's find that and let's address that frequency range. Conversely, someone could say, oh, it sounds really weak, or it sounds really thin. Okay, weak, I'm in this sort of 20 to 80 hertz range. I'm exploring around there. Or it's thin. Okay, it's not got enough low end in general, so I need to address somewhere in all of the low end. So by understanding and ingraining these frequency characteristics in your mind, you'll be able to start finding the frequencies that you need with precision and with speed in order to reduce the guesswork in equalizing and increase your workflow. Let's take a look at the mid-range. So mid-range, again, split into 4 different frequency bands. We've got the lower mid-range from 300 to 600, the middle mid-range from 600 to 1200 or 1.2K, the upper mid-range from 1.2 to 2.4 kilohertz, and the presence range from 2.4 to 5 kilohertz. Again, I've defined for you here lots of frequency characteristics that work with those different bands. So lower mid-range could be described as boxy, or if it sounds nice, it could be nice and full. Or if it hasn't got enough of something, people might say, oh, it's hollow. Or the middle mid-range, if there's too much of something, someone might call it honky or just nasty. Or they might say, that sounds really nasal. We're in this middle mid-range band. In the presence range, for example, they might say, well, that voice sounds really harsh, or it's too far forward. Okay, so we're looking in this 2.5 to 5K range, or it's a bit distant, or I can't hear the diction enough, or there's not enough character. Okay, we need to boost this range. And finally, in the high end, we're split into 2 bands, 5K to 10K as the high end, and 10K to 12K as the extremely high end. And again, we've got different characteristics in that range. So too much could be things like brittle or sibilant or piercing. Or if there's a nice amount of air, then we could have a nice balanced extreme high end. Or if it's feeling dark or dull, then again, we're looking in the high end. So that's, I think, a really useful resource for you. You can download it for free using the link in the description. I would suggest printing it out, sticking it by wherever you work so you can refer to it until it's stuck in your head. Here's an important thing to draw your attention to, though, before we start looking at the anatomy of equalizers. You'll see that each one of these bands more or less doubles in terms of the amount of frequencies within it. So 20 to 40 hertz, then doubles to 40 to 80, which doubles to 80 to 160, which doubles to 160 to 300, and so on, with some very slight variations only here, where we go from 2.4 to 5. That's the only real variation, well, here as well in the upper bass. But basically, we're doubling the frequencies that belong to each of these characteristic bands. Why is that? There's a very good reason. And the reason is because every time you double the frequency of something, you are going up 1 octave in pitch. Let's illustrate that. So if we come to, let's use this equalizer that has a nice representation of it. If we pick this bottom note here, C1, the lowest C on a piano keyboard, you'll see that we're down at 32 hertz. That is the frequency of that note, 32.7 hertz. Okay, so that would be placed in this sub-bass category. If I go up to the next C above that, C2, okay, C1 was 32.7, C2 is 65.4. That's exactly double. And 65.4 would fit in this low bass range. So I was at 32, now I'm at 65. What about the next C above that? The next C above that, 130.8, which is exactly double 65.4. 130.8 would put it in this mid-band range, in this mid-bass range. Okay. The next C above that, 261.6, which is exactly double 130.8. 261.6 would be in this upper bass range. And so on and so forth. And it goes all the way up the frequency spectrum. Trust me, it works. So what that means is that for every octave, if you like, of pitch or octaves of sounds that we can hear, we have a clearly defined frequency range to address characteristics in that octave. And that's a really important thing to be able to appreciate or understand, because it allows us to comprehend a little bit better what these bands kind of really mean. So, you know, if I go to this C that's up here at 1046 cycles, that puts it just in this middle mid-range band. If I'm working with a sound source that has a fundamental up at 1046 hertz, I'm not going to have any of these characteristics really to worry about. They're not present in the sound. So if I'm trying to do EQ things with a sound source that has a fundamental up here, I'm wasting my time, right? Because it's not there. Conversely, if I'm working with a sound source where the fundamental is down at 32, but there's no frequency content above 1000 hertz, then if I'm doing things up in this end, in the upper mid-range and in the high end, again, I'm wasting my time because that sound doesn't have that frequency content present in it. So by understanding this concept of 1 octave per characteristic band, it really helps us to be able to interpret what that could mean in terms of what we're doing to our sound source. Now, I think I'm going to leave it there on this one because I think that is a real good chunk of information, and perhaps you want to go back and rewatch that in order to really embed that information. But I'm going to be back very, very shortly, continuing from exactly this point where we're going to look at all of the different kinds of equalizer that you could come across and look at the anatomy of each different kind of equalizer so that we know exactly how we can adjust or EQ our different sound sources. I'll be back very, very soon.